She was alone in agony. At 3 a.m., when she texted for desperate words to her millionaire husband, "It's time. Come now." His phone responded, but the voice wasn't his. It was the woman who'd been plotting this moment for months. "Have the baby alone. He's mine now." That single message didn't just end a marriage. It lit a fuse that would explode everything 3 families thought they knew about loyalty, love, and revenge. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. John Stories. To every woman who's ever been betrayed by someone who promised forever, may you find strength in places you didn't know existed. May your pain fuel victories your enemies never saw coming. And may you never settle for being anyone's second choice again. In Jesus' name, amen. If stories about karma make you believe in justice, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications right now. Then tell me where you're watching from in the comments, because this woman's response will give you chills. This is how one abandoned wife turned her worst night into a weapon no one could defend against. Now, my beautiful family, let's dive into the story. The response came not as a text, but as a voice message, and Maureen's entire body flooded with relief, so powerful it almost made her forget the contraction tearing through her abdomen, until she pressed play and heard a voice that turned her blood to ice. "Have the baby alone. He's mine now." The voice wasn't his. It was female, composed, dripping with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from twisting a knife that's already buried deep, and it belonged to Vanessa Klein, Grayson's secretary, the woman who'd served Maureen coffee with a smile at board meetings while secretly planning to serve her this nightmare instead. 8 words. That's all it took to murder a marriage that had lasted 3 years, to confirm every whispered suspicion Maureen had ignored, to transform a wife into a widow of her own life while her husband still breathed. The message wasn't just cruel, it was calculated, surgical, designed to maximize devastation at the exact moment when Maureen was most vulnerable, most powerless, most completely and utterly alone. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. If someone did this to you, if the person who'd promised to stand beside you through everything sent another woman to mock you while you were literally bringing their child into the world, could you ever find a way to forgive them? Because what Maureen did next wasn't what anyone expected. She didn't scream, didn't hurl her phone across the room, didn't dissolve into the kind of hysterical sobbing that her pain absolutely entitled her to. Instead, something inside her went completely, terrifyingly quiet. Her tears stopped midstream, as if someone had turned off a faucet, and in the space where her love for Grayson Wolfe used to live, something else moved in, something cold and sharp and patient, something that knew how to wait for the perfect moment to strike back. 37 blocks away, in a penthouse that cost more per month than most people earn in a year, Grayson Wolfe stood at floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at a city he'd conquered, but never actually learned to live in. His father's voice played on an endless loop in his head, that same toxic recording that had been programmed into him since childhood. "Love makes men weak, Grayson. Women are to be entertained, not trusted. The moment you let one of them matter, you've already lost." Edwin Wolfe had spent 30 years turning his son into a perfect replica of himself, brilliant, ruthless, and completely incapable of the kind of vulnerability that makes us human. Grayson had seen Maureen's message the moment it arrived, had felt something twist in his chest that might have been his conscience trying one last time to wake him up. But then he'd done what he always did when emotions threatened to make him weak. He'd handed his phone to Vanessa and walked away like a coward in a $10,000 suit. Vanessa had taken that phone with the kind of hunger that wolves have when they finally corner wounded prey. She typed that response, deleted it, retyped it, then decided to record a voice message instead because she wanted Maureen to hear the triumph in her voice, and wanted her to understand that this wasn't just an affair, it was a complete and total takeover. "Have the baby alone. He's mine now." She'd press send and then watched Maureen's messages pile up afterward, each one more desperate than the last, each one begging for a response that would never come. And Vanessa had smiled the way people smile when they've been planning someone's destruction for months, and finally get to watch it unfold in real time. She whispered to herself, to the empty room, to whatever God rewards cruelty. By sunrise, everyone will know who the real Mrs. Wolfe is. But here's what Vanessa didn't understand about Maureen Jeff's son. Pain doesn't always destroy people. Sometimes it forges them into something infinitely more dangerous than they were before. This wasn't some fragile socialite who'd married for money and status. This was the journalist who'd taken down corrupt politicians with nothing but a laptop and determination. The woman who defended Grayson during the scandal that almost destroyed him. The woman he'd once looked at with something close to worship and whispered, "You're my peace in this storm." That man was gone now, replaced by his father's puppet. And Morin could see the strings so clearly it almost made her laugh. There had been a time when Grayson's hands had trembled when he touched her face, when he'd proposed on a rooftop under stars that cost nothing and meant everything, when he'd promised her that he would never become the kind of man his father was. And now here he was, proving that some people are born to break the promises they make to the people who love them most. Morin pulled herself off that cold marble floor, her body screaming in protest, and she did something that would eventually bring Grayson Wolfe to his knees. She opened her voice recorder and spoke with the kind of clarity that only comes when pain burns away everything except truth. "When our son asks me where his father was the night he was born, I won't lie to protect you. I'll tell him exactly what kind of man you chose to be. I'll tell him that you were building an empire without a heart while his mother was giving him life. And I'll make sure he never, ever makes the mistake of thinking that success means anything if you have to destroy the people who loved you to achieve it." She saved that recording not for Grayson, but for herself, a battle cry disguised as a goodbye, a promise that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning, and that Vanessa Klein had absolutely no idea what she'd just started. Memory has a cruel way of making betrayal hurt twice, once when it happens, and again every time you remember how good things used to be before everything shattered. Morin's mind dragged her backward against her will, pulling her into the past like drowning in reverse. Back to when Grayson Wolfe wasn't a monster, but the man who'd looked at her across a coffee shop 3 years ago with eyes that actually saw her instead of through her. She'd been investigating his company for corruption allegations, armed with evidence and righteous fury, ready to expose another billionaire who thought money made him untouchable. But then she discovered something that derailed her entire story. He was innocent, framed by a business partner who'd wanted his empire. And she'd been about to destroy the wrong man. The old Morin would have published anyway, would have let the truth sort itself out later. But something in his exhausted desperation made her dig deeper, made her risk her career and credibility to uncover the real story. And when she'd cleared his name with an article that saved everything he'd built, Grayson had shown up at her apartment at midnight with tears in his eyes and said 6 words that should have been a warning instead of a promise. "You're my peace in this storm." But peace was never what the Wolfe family valued, and storms were meant to be weaponized, not calmed. And the man who'd once held her like she was the only solid thing in his collapsing world had eventually let his father's poison convince him that vulnerability was weakness and love was a liability. That same mouth that had kissed her forehead and whispered promises now stayed silent while another woman mocked her pain. And Morin wondered if you could actually die from the weight of realizing that the person you'd saved had become the person who'd destroy you. She'd given him everything, her credibility, her reputation, her trust, her body, her future. And he'd repaid her by handing his phone to his mistress and walking away while she brought his child into the world alone. Vanessa Klein wasn't just enjoying Morin's suffering. She was conducting it like a symphony, orchestrating every note of agony with the precision of someone who'd been planning this hostile takeover for months. She sat in Grayson's penthouse, scrolling through Morin's increasingly frantic messages on his phone, watching the desperation escalate from "please answer" to "I'm scared" to "how could you do this to me?" And each message fed something dark and hungry inside her that had been starving for validation her entire life. Vanessa had grown up poor, clawing her way out of trailer parks and community colleges, learning early that nice girls finish last, and that the only way to win was to be willing to do what others wouldn't, lie better, manipulate smarter, and never, ever feel guilty about collateral damage. She'd studied Grayson like a doctoral thesis, identified every weakness his father had installed in him, and exploited each one with surgical precision until she'd become indispensable, irreplaceable. The voice in his ear when decisions needed making, and the body in his bed when loneliness came calling. Do you think people like Vanessa are born evil, or does the world create them by rewarding cruelty and punishing kindness? She stared at her reflection in the penthouse window, admiring how perfectly she'd positioned herself, and she made a phone call that would detonate Morin's life even further. "Mother," Vanessa said, her voice sugary with false concern, "I need you to call the hospital and tell them that Grayson Wolf's wife is mentally unstable and shouldn't be allowed to make medical decisions alone." "Yes, I know it'll lie. That's exactly the point." She ended the call and turned to find Grayson standing in the doorway, his face unreadable, his silence complicit, and she walked toward him with the confidence of someone who'd already won. "She'll be fine," Vanessa said, running her hand down his chest with possessive familiarity. "Women have babies alone all the time, and honestly, Grayson, she was always too emotional for someone in your position. Your father told me himself that she was making you weak." Grayson flinched at his father's name, but didn't pull away, didn't defend his wife, didn't do anything except stand there like a man who'd already accepted that he'd sold his soul and couldn't afford to buy it back. "He said that?" Grayson asked, his voice hollow, and Vanessa smiled because she knew she'd struck gold. "He said you were becoming your mother, soft, sentimental, destined to lose everything because you couldn't separate business from emotion. But don't worry, I told him I'd handle it. Told him I'd make sure you stayed focused on what actually matters." She kissed him then, not with passion, but with ownership, marking territory she conquered. And Grayson kissed her back because resistance required strength he'd stopped pretending to have. What Vanessa didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have predicted because she'd never actually loved anything except power, was that she'd just made the fatal mistake every villain makes. She'd underestimated the woman she was destroying. Rain doesn't care about your suffering. It falls on palaces and gutters with the same indifference. And as it hammered against the hospital windows at 4 a.m, Morin Jeffson pushed her son into a world that his father had chosen not to witness. The delivery room should have been filled with nervous excitement and whispered encouragement, should have had a husband gripping her hand and telling her she was doing amazing. But instead there was only the clinical efficiency of nurses who'd seen this tragedy play out 1,000 times before and had learned to keep their pity professional. The doctor coaching her breathing was a stranger. The hand she squeezed belonged to a nurse whose name she'd already forgotten. And when her son finally emerged screaming his arrival into existence, the first sound he heard wasn't his father's voice, but his mother's sob. Not from pain, but from the devastating realization that she'd have to be enough for both of them. The nurse placed a baby on Morin's chest, and he was perfect in that way that all newborns are perfect, tiny and red and furious at being born. And the nurse whispered something that Morin would remember for the rest of her life. "He's strong, just like his mother." Strong wasn't how Morin felt. Strong was a lie people told women when they'd survived something that should have destroyed them. A participation trophy for enduring the unendurable. But as she looked at her son's face, she made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everything that came next. This child would never know weakness, would never watch his mother crumble under the weight of abandonment, would never learn that love makes you vulnerable enough to be destroyed by the people who promised to protect you. She named him right there, without consulting the man who'd contributed DNA but abandoned responsibility. And she chose a name that meant warrior, Callum Jeffson, because he would carry her name, not his father's. And he would learn that strength doesn't come from the people who stay, but from surviving the ones who leave. 20 blocks away, Grayson sat at his desk pretending to review contracts while actually staring at nothing, his mind circling the same thought like a vulture over roadkill. He'd missed it, missed the moment his son was born, missed the chance to be anything other than the villain in this story. His father's words played on repeat, that toxic gospel Edwin Wolf had preached until it became Grayson's entire theology. "Attachment kills men like us, son. Your mother proved that when she loved me enough to go insane trying to fix what was never broken, just built differently." Grayson had watched his mother deteriorate under the weight of loving a man incapable of loving her back, had seen her transform from vibrant to invisible, and he'd promised himself he'd never put anyone through that pain. So instead he'd become the thing that caused it, the poison instead of the victim, because apparently cruelty was hereditary in the Wolf bloodline. Vanessa entered his office without knocking, because women who've already conquered, you don't need permission. And she slid her arms around him from behind with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won the war. "Stop torturing yourself," she murmured against his neck. "She made her choice when she trapped you with a pregnancy, and you made yours by choosing your legacy over her manipulation. your father would be proud. But Edwin Wolfe had never been proud of anything except the empire he'd built on the graves of everyone who'd ever trusted him, and Grayson was starting to suspect that legacy was just another word for loneliness with better furniture. "What if he asks about me someday?" Grayson said, his voice cracking in a way that made Vanessa's jaw tighten with irritation. "What if my son grows up wondering why I wasn't there?" Vanessa pulled back, her eyes flashing with something between contempt and calculation. "Then you tell him the truth, that his mother used him as a weapon, and you refuse to be held hostage by biology. If Vanessa represents everything wrong with ambition, type karma is coming in the comments, because what she doesn't know yet is that her own destruction is already in motion." Morin held Callum against her chest and felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with childbirth and everything to do with rebirth. She wasn't the woman who texted desperately for help anymore. She was the mother of a son who would never watch his father break his mother's spirit. The attending physician, Dr. Malcolm Reese, had been watching this tragedy unfold with increasing disgust, and as he completed Morin's discharge paperwork, he made a decision that would crack open secrets the Wolfe family had buried for decades. Trust becomes a foreign language after betrayal teaches you that the people closest to you speak fluent lies. And when Dr. Malcolm Reese knocked on Morin's hospital room door 3 hours after Callum's birth, she looked at him with a kind of suspicion that comes from learning that kindness might just be cruelty wearing a better mask. Malcolm wasn't just any attending physician. He was a ghost from Grayson's past, a childhood friend who'd watched Edwin Wolfe systematically destroy every decent impulse his son had ever possessed, and he'd spent the last decade wondering if the boy he'd once known was completely dead or just buried under layers of his father's poison. He'd recognized Morin's name on the admission paperwork and felt something he hadn't felt in years working in a hospital where tragedy was just another Tuesday. Rage so pure it felt like medicine. "Mrs. Wolfe," Malcolm said, and Morin flinched at the name she was already planning to shed like dead skin. "I need to tell you something about the family you married into, and you're not going to want to hear it, but you need to know before they come for your son." Morin's arms tightened around Callum instinctively, that primal mother-animal response that evolution installed in women who'd spent millennia protecting their children from predators. Except this time, the predator wore Italian suits and controlled half the city's economy. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice hoarse from screaming through labor that no one had been there to witness. And Malcolm pulled a chair close to her bed with the urgency of someone delivering a warning before the bomb goes off. "The Wolves don't love, Morin. They own, they collect, they control. And right now Edwin is probably already planning how to take that baby from you and raise him to be exactly like them. Because that's what he did to Grayson, what he did to every person who ever got close to that family." Malcolm's words weren't speculation. They were testimony from someone who'd watched it happen, who'd been Grayson's best friend until the day he'd tried to intervene, and Edwin had made sure he'd never get close to his son again. Would you trust a stranger warning you about your own family, or would you think he had his own agenda? Morin studied Malcolm's face, looking for the angle, searching for whatever he wanted from her, because 3 years of being married to a wolf had taught her that nobody does anything without calculating what they'll gain. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, and Malcolm laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that comes from a place where hope went to die. "Because I loved him like a brother once, and I watched his father turn him into a monster, and I'll be damned if I watch them do the same thing to your son. And because when Grayson finds out what Vanessa really is, it's going to detonate everything, and you need to be ready." That last part hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled, and Morin leaned forward despite her exhaustion. "What do you mean what she really is?" Malcolm hesitated, weighing how much truth she could handle, then decided that half-truths were just full lies with better marketing. "Vanessa Klein isn't just sleeping with your husband, Morin. She's pregnant, and before you let that destroy you, you should know that the baby isn't Grayson's." The words hit Morin like a physical blow, but instead of crumbling, she felt something else, a dark, vindictive satisfaction that maybe karma was real after all and Vanessa had overplayed her hand. "Then whose is it?" Morin asked, and Malcolm's next words rewrote the entire game board. "Edwin Wolfe's. She's been sleeping with Grayson's father for 8 months, playing both of them like chess pieces, and Edwin's planning to use that baby to replace Grayson at the company, to install a child he can mold from birth without all the mistakes he made with his son." The revelation was so twisted, so breathtakingly cruel, that Morin almost laughed, because of course the Wolf family's betrayal would have layers. They couldn't just cheat like normal people. They had to turn infidelity into a corporate hostile takeover. Malcolm watched her process this information, watched her face cycle through shock and disgust, and then settle into something that looked dangerously close to strategy. "I have proof," he said quietly, pulling out his phone and showing her photographs that would burn Vanessa's entire scheme to ashes. Text between Vanessa and Edwin. Medical records he'd obtained through channels he'd never admit to. Documentation of payments Edwin had made to keep her quiet. "The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Morin looked at her sleeping son, then back at the evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed her marriage, and she smiled for the first time since labor had started. "I'm going to make sure Vanessa Klein regrets ever learning my husband's name." Revenge doesn't announce itself with trumpets and declarations. It arrives in plain envelopes delivered by courier at dawn, and when Morin opened hers 6 days after giving birth, she found 2 things that proved Grayson Wolf had finally grown a spine, but had used it to stab her in the back one final time. The first was a prenuptial termination letter, signed and notarized, dissolving their marriage with a kind of cold legal efficiency that only billionaire attorneys can achieve when they're paid enough to make love disappear on paper. The second was worse because it was personal, because it was designed to hurt in a way that contracts couldn't. The engagement ring he'd proposed with, the one he'd claimed had belonged to his grandmother, the one lie in their relationship she'd actually believed, now broken perfectly in half and wrapped in tissue paper like a corpse. The symbolism was so heavy-handed it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so devastatingly effective. And Morin held those 2 pieces of platinum and diamond and realized that Grayson had finally learned how to communicate his feelings. He'd just waited until those feelings were contempt. But symbols cut both ways, and what Grayson didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd spent their entire marriage underestimating her, was that Morin had been documenting everything since the night Vanessa's voice had murdered her hope. She'd kept every text, every voicemail, every receipt from the penthouse Grayson had been renting for his affair, every piece of evidence that would prove abandonment and emotional cruelty when the lawyers started circling. Malcolm had warned her that the wolves would try to erase her, would use their money and connections to rewrite history until she was the villain and they were the victims. But Morin had spent years as an investigative journalist before becoming a discarded wife, and she knew that the truth wasn't what actually happened. It was what you could prove happened. The letter had come from Edwin's office, not Grayson's, and that detail told Morin everything she needed to know about who was actually running this execution. Edwin Wolf had spent 37 years turning his son into a weapon, and had finally succeeded. Had taken a man who'd once cried while proposing and transformed him into something that could sign divorce papers, while his week-old son slept in a bassinet he'd never seen. How does a father teach his child that love is weakness without destroying the part of them that makes them human? Edwin had perfected the technique through generations of emotional abuse disguised as preparation for the real world. Had convinced Grayson that his mother's breakdown hadn't been caused by Edwin's cruelty, but by her own weakness. Had rewritten family history until the victim became the villain, and the villain became the visionary. Grayson sat in his father's study that same morning, staring at the glass of whiskey Edwin had poured for him at 9 a.m., and he finally asked the question he'd been too terrified to ask his entire life. "Did you ever actually love Mom, or was she just another acquisition?" Edwin didn't even look up from the financial reports he was reviewing, didn't pause or flinch or show any indication that his son had just asked about the woman who'd given birth to him before descending into madness. "Your mother was beautiful and intelligent and came from the right family. She served her purpose, and when she couldn't handle what that purpose required, she made herself irrelevant." The casual brutality of that response should have shocked Grayson, but instead it just confirmed what he'd always suspected. He'd inherited his capacity for cruelty honestly, had learned abandonment at his father's knee, and was now repeating the cycle with Morin because apparently trauma was the only thing the Wolf family knew how to pass down through generations. "Morin's different though," Grayson said, and even he could hear how pathetic that sounded, how desperate. "She saved me when everyone else wanted to destroy me." Edwin finally looked up, and his smile was the kind that sharks have right before they bite. "She saved your reputation, son, not you. And now she's a liability with legal claims to your assets, and a child she'll use as leverage for the next 18 years. So I did what you didn't have the strength to do, and I ended it cleanly. Grayson felt something crack inside him that might have been the last piece of his conscience, and he drank the whiskey because numbness was easier than feeling. What about Vanessa's baby? He asked, testing whether his father knew that he knew. Edwin's expression didn't change. What about it? Time doesn't heal wounds when you're too busy weaponizing them. And 12 months after Callum's birth, Moore and Jeff's son walked into Manhattan Superior Court with a lawsuit that would detonate the Wolf Empire like a controlled demolition from the inside out. She'd spent that year transforming from abandoned wife into a vengeful angel, had used every skill she'd honed as a journalist to build a case so airtight that even the Wolf's army of attorneys looked nervous when they read the filing. Breach of marital contract, emotional abandonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Each charge was backed by documentation, so thorough it read less like a lawsuit and more like a murder confession written by the killers themselves. The voicemail from Vanessa, the texts proving Grayson knew she was in labor, the penthouse rental agreements, the financial transfers to his mistress. Morin had collected evidence the way some people collect stamps, except her collection was about to cost Grayson everything his father had taught him to value more than his own humanity. The courtroom filled with journalists who'd once been Morin's colleagues, and they looked at her with a mixture of respect and horror because they all knew what it meant when one of their own stopped reporting stories and became one instead. Grayson sat at the defendant's table looking like a man who'd aged a decade in a year, his expensive suit hanging on a frame that had lost 20 pounds to guilt and insomnia. And for the first time since abandoning his wife in labor, he had to sit in a room where his money couldn't control the narrative. Vanessa had been subpoenaed as a witness, and she walked in wearing white like she was the bride at someone else's funeral, her growing belly visible under designer fabric, playing the role of devoted mother-to-be with the kind of commitment that deserves an Oscar or a prison sentence. Morin's attorney was a woman named Petra Vasquez, who'd built her reputation destroying powerful men who thought their wealth made them untouchable. And she approached the witness stand where Vanessa sat with the smile of a surgeon who genuinely loves her work. Ms. Klein, can you confirm that on the morning of March 15th at 3:07 a.m., you sent a voice message from Grayson Wolf's phone to his wife, who was in active labor? Vanessa's carefully constructed composure flickered for just a second, but she recovered with practiced ease. I don't recall the specific time, but yes, I may have responded to a message on his behalf. He was in an important meeting. Petra's smile widened like a knife being unsheathed. At 3 in the morning? What kind of meeting happens at 3 in the morning, Ms. Klein? The courtroom waited, hungry for blood, and Vanessa realized too late that she'd walked into an ambush. I misspoke. It wasn't a meeting. He was sleeping, and I didn't want to disturb him. Do you think Vanessa actually believed she'd get away with this? Or was she just so used to manipulating men that she forgot how courtrooms work? Petra nodded like a teacher, encouraging a student who's about to fail spectacularly. So you took it upon yourself to respond to his wife's emergency without waking him. Let's hear exactly what you said. The bailiff pressed play on the audio file, and Vanessa's voice filled the courtroom with a clarity that made even the judge's expression harden. Have the baby alone. He's mine now. 8 words that turned the entire courtroom into a jury of public opinion. 8 words that proved this wasn't just an affair, but a calculated campaign of cruelty. And the gasps from the gallery sounded like a collective exhale of disgust. Grayson's face was drained of color because hearing it played in open court made it real in a way he'd been able to deny when it was just between the 3 of them. And he finally understood what Morin had known for a year, that some actions can't be undone, only paid for. But Petra wasn't finished because mercy wasn't in her vocabulary when she smelled victory. Ms. Klein, you're pregnant, correct? Vanessa's hand moved instinctively to her belly, protective and possessive. Yes, I'm 6 months along. Petra pulled out a document with the theatrical flair of someone who'd been saving the best for last. This is a DNA paternity test ordered by this court 3 weeks ago. Would you like to tell everyone whose baby you're carrying, or should I? The silence that followed was the kind that precedes explosions, and Vanessa's face transformed from confident to cornered in the space of a heartbeat. That's inadmissible, you can't, but Petra cut her off with legal precision. The court determined it was relevant to establishing patterns of deception, Miss Klein. So I'll ask again, whose baby are you carrying? Vanessa looked at Grayson, at Edwin in the back row, at the exit she couldn't reach, and her voice came out as a whisper. Edwin Wolf's. Destruction makes better television than construction, which is why the world watched the Wolf empire collapse in real time, with a kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters and celebrity meltdowns. The DNA revelation didn't just end Vanessa's scheme. It detonated every relationship in that courtroom, turned father against son and lies into evidence, and transformed Morin from victim into the woman who'd brought down a dynasty with nothing but patience and documentation. Within 48 hours of that courtroom bombshell, 3 board members resigned from Wolf Industries, citing ethical concerns, which was corporate language, for we're not going down with this sinking ship. And investors started pulling funding, so fast the company's stock price looked like it was in free fall. Grayson had built his entire identity on being his father's successor, on proving he could be ruthless enough to deserve the empire Edwin had constructed. And now he was watching it crumble, because the old man had been playing a completely different game with completely different players. Morin didn't celebrate when the verdict came down in her favor. Celebration implied surprise, and she'd known she would when the moment Petra Vasquez agreed to take her case. The settlement was substantial enough to fund the vision that had been growing in her mind since the night she'd given birth alone, and within 3 months she'd launched the Callum Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to supporting women who'd been abandoned during pregnancy by wealthy partners who thought money could erase responsibility. Her first press conference went viral, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Standing in front of cameras with her son on her hip, wearing the kind of quiet strength that comes from surviving something designed to destroy you, and speaking with the precision of someone who'd learned that the best revenge isn't cruelty, but success. This foundation exists because my son deserves to grow up in a world where abandonment has consequences, and where women aren't punished for trusting the wrong men, Morin said, and every word was a knife thrown at Grayson's reputation with surgical accuracy. The media loved her because America loves a comeback story, especially when it involves a woman refusing to be broken by the kind of betrayal that should have buried her. Magazine covers, morning show interviews, keynote speeches at women's conferences. Morin became the face of resilience, and every appearance was another nail in the coffin of the Wolf family's credibility. Meanwhile, Grayson's world was dissolving like sugar in acid. Investors fleeing, business partners suddenly unreachable. The empire his father had spent 40 years building now contaminated by scandals that no amount of money could sterilize. If you think Vanessa deserves worse than what she's getting, drop a comment saying karma always collects, because her story isn't over yet and neither is her suffering. Grayson found himself doing something he'd sworn he'd never do. He drove to his father's estate at midnight, drunk on expensive whiskey and cheap regrets. And he walked into Edwin's study without knocking, because sons who've been destroyed by their fathers don't need permission to confront their destroyers. You told me to never love, Grayson said, his voice raw with the kind of pain that comes from realizing you've wasted your entire life following instructions that were designed to poison you. You said attachment kills men like us, that mom went crazy because she was weak, that Morin would do the same. But you lied about all of it, didn't you? Edwin sat behind his desk looking older than Grayson had ever seen him, the king of a crumbling kingdom, and he poured 2 glasses of scotch with hands that trembled slightly. I didn't lie, son. I told you the truth as I understood it, which is that loving someone gives them the power to destroy you, and your mother proved that when she hung herself because I couldn't be what she needed. The revelation hit Grayson like a physical blow because he'd been told his mother died from an illness, not from choosing death over living with Edwin's emotional cruelty. She killed herself? Grayson whispered, and Edwin nodded with a kind of casual acknowledgement people use when discussing weather. Loving me destroyed her, and I didn't want the same thing to happen to you. So I taught you to be stronger, to value power over sentiment, to never give anyone that kind of control. I was protecting you. But protection that requires destroying your capacity for human connection isn't protection. It's just preemptive murder of everything that makes life worth living. You didn't protect me, Grayson said, standing up with the sudden clarity of someone who's finally understood they've been poisoned their entire life. You turned me into you, And now I can't even look at my own son, because I'm too terrified I'll do to him what you did to me." Edwin's face hardened into the mask he'd worn for 40 years. "Then you finally understand what power costs. You think Morin's better off? She's raising your son alone, being strong for the cameras, while probably crying herself to sleep. And that's what love does, Grayson. It makes you responsible for someone else's pain." But before Grayson could respond, before he could tell his father that maybe being responsible for someone's happiness was better than being responsible for their destruction, Edwin's face contorted in sudden agony, and he collapsed forward onto his desk, clutching his chest. Grayson called for an ambulance, performed CPR with hands that shook from adrenaline and whiskey, but some hearts were too damaged to save, and Edwin Wolfe died on his study floor surrounded by everything he'd valued more than his family. The paramedics found a sealed envelope in Edwin's jacket pocket addressed to Morin Jeff's son, and when they gave it to Grayson at the hospital, he held it like it might explode because knowing his father, it probably would. Dead men's letters carry weight that living apologies never could. And when Grayson finally opened the envelope his father had addressed to Morin 3 days after Edwin's funeral, he found words that rewrote everything he thought he understood about the man who'd shaped his entire existence. The handwriting was shaky, written by someone who knew death was coming and wanted to confess before the grave made honesty impossible. And it read like a deathbed conversion from a man who'd spent his life preaching a gospel of emotional destruction. "Morin, you were the only woman who ever looked at my son and saw the humanity I spent 30 years trying to kill. If there's any hope for Grayson's redemption, it exists because you loved the parts of him I taught him to hate. And I'm sorry I turned love into a weakness when it should have been his greatest strength." The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing Edwin's regrets and admitting that he'd manipulated Vanessa into seducing Grayson as a test, a sick experiment to see if his son could resist attachment the way he'd been trained, and that when Grayson had failed by falling for Vanessa's manipulation, Edwin had decided to punish him by making her pregnant and planning to replace him entirely. Grayson read those words over and over until they stopped making sense and started making too much sense, until he understood that his entire life had been a psychological experiment conducted by a father who'd confused cruelty with preparation and emotional abuse with parenting. He'd lost Morin, abandoned his son, destroyed his own capacity for happiness, all because he'd been following instructions from a man who admitted in his final moments that those instructions were poison disguised as wisdom. The realization didn't absolve Grayson of responsibility. Knowing you were programmed doesn't erase the damage you caused while running the program, but it did give him something he hadn't felt in over a year, the faint, terrifying possibility that maybe he wasn't beyond saving. Morin received the letter via courier on the same day she was scheduled to speak at a charity gala for the Callum Foundation, and she read it in her dressing room while Callum played with blocks on the floor, blissfully unaware that his grandfather had just apologized from beyond the grave. Part of her wanted to crumple the letter and throw it away because Edwin's regrets couldn't undo the night she'd spent in labor alone or the year she'd spent rebuilding herself from ruins. But another part, the part that still remembered who Grayson used to be before his father's poison took full effect, wondered if redemption was possible for men who'd been systematically destroyed by their own families. Could you forgive someone who hurt you if you discovered they'd been hurt first? Or does trauma just become an explanation rather than an excuse? Morin folded the letter carefully and placed it in her purse, not because she'd forgiven Edwin or Grayson, but because her son deserved to one day understand that his father's abandonment had roots that went deeper than simple cruelty. The charity gala was held at the Granderson Hotel, the same venue where Morin and Grayson had gotten married 3 years earlier, and the universe's sense of irony was apparently functioning at peak efficiency. She stood in the ballroom where she'd once danced with a man who'd promised forever, now surrounded by supporters who celebrated her strength and donors who wanted to be associated with her story of survival. And she felt completely alone in a room full of people who thought they knew her. Then the music stopped mid-song, and Morin looked up to see Grayson standing at the entrance, looking like a ghost who'd wandered into the wrong dimension, thinner, haunted, wearing a suit that hung on him like it was borrowed from someone who still had a future. The room went silent with a kind of anticipation that precedes either violence or revelation, and Grayson walked toward Morin with the careful steps of someone approaching a bomb they'd built themselves. "I know I have no right to be here," he said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, because apparently this conversation was going to be public, whether either of them wanted it to be. "I know that nothing I say can undo what I did, and I'm not here to ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it, but I found my father's letter, and I need you to know that I understand now how completely I destroyed the only real thing I ever had." Morin stood frozen, torn between the woman who wanted to throw her drink in his face and the woman who remembered loving someone who might have existed before Edwin killed him. Would you give someone a second chance after what Grayson did? Or are some betrayals too deep to survive? Before Morin could respond, her phone buzzed with a notification, and she looked down to see a video message from an unknown number. She pressed play, and Vanessa's face filled the screen, not the composed, manipulative Vanessa from the courtroom, but a broken version filmed in what looked like an airport terminal, mascara streaking her face. Her voice raw, with the kind of desperation that comes from realizing you've lost everything. "I need everyone to know the truth," Vanessa said into the camera, her hands shaking. "Grayson never knew about Edwin and me. I manipulated him, used him, destroyed his marriage, because Edwin promised me power, and I was stupid enough to believe that power was worth becoming a monster." She paused, wiping her face with trembling hands. "He was my puppet, but the strings were never his, they were his father's. And I pulled them because I thought winning meant taking everything from someone who had what I wanted, but all I really did was prove that you can gain the whole world and still lose your soul." The video ended, and Morin looked at Grayson with new understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but the recognition that they'd both been casualties in Edwin Wolf's war against human connection. Grayson knelt in front of her right there in the ballroom, in front of cameras and donors and everyone who'd watched their marriage collapse. And he said the only true thing he'd said in over a year. "You gave me life when I gave you pain. I can't ask you to love me again, but please, let me prove that the man you saved still exists somewhere under the damage my father caused." Forgiveness doesn't arrive like lightning with dramatic thunder. It seeps in slowly, like water, finding cracks in concrete. And over the course of 12 months, Morin watched Grayson systematically dismantle everything his father had built inside him and attempt to construct something that resembled a decent human being. He'd signed over his remaining shares in Wolf Industries to a board that immediately voted to rebrand the company and distance it from the family name that had become synonymous with emotional carnage. And he'd taken a position at the Callum Foundation not as a donor seeking redemption through checkbooks, but as an actual employee doing actual work that didn't come with executive parking or the illusion of importance. Morin had made him start at the bottom, answering phones, processing donation paperwork, driving supply trucks to shelters, because if he was serious about proving he'd changed, then he needed to understand what it felt like to be powerless and serve others instead of being served. The first time Grayson met his son was on a supervised visit 6 months into his rehabilitation, and Callum had looked at this stranger with the brutal honesty that only toddlers possess and said, "You made mommy cry." Those 4 words had broken something in Grayson that money couldn't fix and apologies couldn't reach, and he'd knelt down to Callum's level and said the truest thing he'd ever told another human being. "I did, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be someone who makes her smile instead." Morin had watched that interaction from the doorway, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, waiting for Grayson to say something that would prove this was all performance. But he just sat on the floor and let Callum ignore him while he played with toy trucks, content to be in the same room as his son even if his son wanted nothing to do with him. Redemption isn't a destination you reach. It's a direction you walk in every day while knowing you'll never arrive. And Grayson walked that direction with the dedication of someone who understood he was one mistake away from losing his last chance at becoming human again. He attended therapy 3 times a week, not the expensive kind where rich people pay someone to validate their dysfunction, but real therapy where a woman named Dr. Chin made him confront how his father's abuse had created neural pathways that equated love with weakness and vulnerability with danger. He joined a support group for men trying to unlearn toxic masculinity, which sounded like the kind of thing the old Grayson would have mocked, but the new version, the one Morin was cautiously, terrifyingly beginning to believe might be real, showed up every Tuesday and talked about his failures with the kind of honesty that made other broken men feel less alone. Mourn didn't make it easy for him because easy forgiveness is just permission to repeat the same damage. And she set boundaries that were less like fences and more like minefields that Grayson had to navigate perfectly or lose everything. No unsupervised visits with Callum until he'd completed a full year of therapy. No romantic gestures or attempts to resurrect their marriage until she decided she was ready to even consider that possibility. No using his family tragedy as an excuse for the choices he'd made when he'd had the agency to choose differently. Do you think people can truly change, or do they just get better at hiding who they've always been? Grayson accepted every boundary without negotiation, without the entitled pushback of someone who thought his suffering earned him shortcuts. And that acceptance was what slowly convinced Morin that maybe, possibly, against all logical odds, he was actually doing the work instead of performing it. The hospital room where everything had ended was the same hospital room where something new began. Morin stood there on Callum's second birthday, remembering the night she'd given birth alone while rain hammered the windows and nurses had whispered about her strength. Now the sun streamed through those same windows, and Callum took his first unsteady steps toward both of his parents, wobbling between them like a tiny drunk person discovering gravity was optional. Grayson caught him and lifted him up with tears streaming down his face because he'd missed so many firsts. First breath, first word. First time Callum had looked at Maureen and said "Mama," with the certainty of someone who knew exactly who'd save his life. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," Grayson whispered to Callum, who didn't understand apologies, but patted his father's wet cheek with the instinctive kindness of children who haven't yet learned to weaponize affection. Morin watched them together and felt something shift inside her that had been frozen since that night at 3 a.m. when Vanessa's voice had killed her hope. Not forgiveness exactly, because some wounds leave scars that never fully fade, but maybe the beginning of believing that love could survive even the coldest betrayal if both people were willing to do the excruciating work of rebuilding trust from ashes. "He's going to ask about that night eventually," Morin said quietly, and Grayson nodded without looking away from their son. "I know, and when he does, I'll tell him the truth, that I failed you both in the worst possible way, and that his mother was strong enough to survive what should have destroyed her, and that I spent every day after trying to become someone worthy of the second chance she gave me. If you believe that love can be rebuilt after betrayal this deep, share this story with someone who needs to know that redemption is possible even when it seems impossible." The screen faded to black with Morin's final words echoing like a prayer. "At 3 a.m., I gave birth alone and thought my life was ending. But sometimes the greatest rebirth happens when pain becomes purpose, and the family you lose becomes the family you choose to rebuild, one painful, beautiful choice at a time." Vanessa's fate remained unspoken but understood. She'd fled the country carrying Edwin's child, her name now permanently attached to one of the most spectacular downfalls in corporate history, living proof that karma doesn't need our help to collect what's owed. And if you're still watching, if this story made you feel something, drop a comment telling me whether you'd give Grayson that second chance. Because the most important stories are the ones that force us to confront what we'd actually do when faced with the same impossible choice. If this story moved you, if Morin's strength reminded you that survival is the best revenge, then subscribe to this channel right now and turn on those notifications. Because every week, we bring you stories about people who were counted out, written off, abandoned at their lowest, and came back stronger than anyone thought possible. Don't let YouTube's algorithm decide whether you see the next one. Hit that subscribe button, smash the notification bell, and stay tuned because the next story might be even more shocking than this one. I'll see you in the next video.